Hello everyone and welcome to the Sew It Yourself pattern channel. In this video I will show you how to sew the Kylie jacket. The first step is to cut stripes of fusible interfacing 2 cm wide and the length of each shoulder. The interfacing has one smooth side and one textured side. Place the interfacing with the textured side facing down on the wrong side of the fabric, so on the left side, along the shoulder edges of both front pieces and both back pieces. And now press, do not slide the iron on the smooth side to fuse the interfacing on the fabric. And do that at all shoulders. And then place the 2 back pieces right sides together, aligning the center back edges. Pin the back together and then sew along the center back with a 1 cm seam allowance. And after that, press the seam. And now serge the back seam using an overlock stitch, or if you don't have a serger, use a zigzag stitch. And then press the seam flat. And then press the seam allowance to one side. Choose one direction and keep it consistent. And then turn the garment right side out and press again from the outside. Make sure the seam allowance underneath is lying neatly and fully pressed in the same direction. Then you can take some pins to secure it there, and then from the right side of the garment, sew a straight top stitch, approximately 2 mm away from the seam line. After top stitching, press the seam allowance one more so it lays completely flat and neat. And the next step is to take the front and back pieces and place them right sides together, aligning the shoulder edges. Make sure all edges match evenly. Pin the shoulder seams in place to prevent shifting. And now you can sew the shoulder seams with a 8 mm seam allowance. And after sewing, press the seam. And then finish the raw edges with an overlock or a zigzag stitch. And also do the same at the other shoulder. And then press the seam allowance neatly towards the back. Then turn the garment to the right side and press again. Make sure that the seam allowance lies smoothly towards the back. And then pin the seam allowance in place. Finally, top stitch from the right side, sewing approximately 2 mm away from the seam. And also do the same at the other shoulder. And the next step is to serge all sides of the pockets and to serge all side seams from the back and from the front. And then take your pockets and place the pockets accordingly to the pattern markings, the right side of the pockets against the right side of the front and back pieces, and pin them in place. And now sew the pockets to the side seams with a 1 cm seam allowance. And also do that with the other pockets. And now press the seam flat and then fold the pocket piece out and press it flat again. And then top stitch the pocket edge close to the seam to keep them flat and secure. And then place the back piece on top of the front piece, right sides facing, and pin them together along the side seams, including the pockets. And then you can start to sew with a 1 cm seam allowance. When you reach the pocket opening, stop sewing, leave the needle in the fabric, lift the presser foot, and then sew a few stitches forward and back to secure the pocket edge, and then sew around the pocket back. When you reach the other end of the pocket opening, again sew a few stitches forward and back to secure it. And after you have sewn both side seams with the pockets, take a scissor and clip into the seam allowance, right at the points where each pocket opening begins and ends, but not through the stitching line. This allows the seam allowance to lay flat. And then iron the seam allowance. And the next step is to take each sleeve piece and fold it right sides together and pin them along the sleeve seam. And now you can start to sew both sleeves using a 1 cm seam allowance. And after sewing, finish the raw edges with an overlock stitch or zigzag stitch. And then press the seam well to set the stitches and give the sleeve a clean shape. And also iron from the right side and make sure that the seam allowance looks in one direction. The next step is to turn the jacket body inside out to insert the sleeve into the armhole, right sides together. Make sure the sleeve seam lines up with the jacket side seam and pin the sleeve evenly all the way around the armhole, distributing the fabric smoothly. And then sew the sleeve into the armhole with a 1 cm seam allowance. And do the same also with the other sleeve. And after the sleeves are sewn in, serge the armhole seam allowance with an overlock stitch or zigzag stitch. And then press the seam allowance neatly. And then make sure that the seam allowance lays neatly towards the sleeve. And also iron there. For the next step, take your loop strap and press it in half lengthwise so that the wrong sides are together. Then open it again and then fold both long raw edges towards the center crease and press. And then fold the strip in half, lengthwise, once more, so that the folded edges meet and the raw edges are enclosed, and press well. And now stitch very close to the open edge to secure the loop. And for a clean, balanced look, top stitch close to the edge on the other side as well. This keeps the loop flat and stable. And then give the loop strap a good press. And the next step is to take the belt piece and fold it right sides together lengthwise. Pin along the long edge and the two short ends and leave an 8 cm gap. And start at one short end, sew to the corner, stop with the needle down, lift the presser foot and turn the fabric, and then continue sewing along the long edge, but leave an 8 cm gap along this long side for turning. And then keep sewing, and then again stop, turn the fabric at the next corner and sew along the second short edge to close. And then give the belt a good press. And then trim the seam allowance at the corners to reduce bulk, but be careful. And then turn the belt right side out through the gap. Gently push out the corners with a pen or a tool. And then give the belt a good press. And the next step is to top stitch close to the edge all the way around the belt to give it a clean finish and also to close the turning gap. For that, put the seam allowance inside from the gap. And then you can start to top stitch all the way around the belt. And for the next step, try on your jacket with the belt and decide where you want to have your belt loops to sit. Then take your prepared loop strap and cut it in half, and then you have your two loop straps. And now take your strap and position it that way. And first we will secure it here. And now sew over it multiple times to secure it. Then fold the strap up and also sew there to secure it. Again, multiple times to secure it perfectly. And then take your belt and position the belt inside the loop to check the fit. And make sure to leave space so the belt can move freely, and adjust the strap placement. Then take the belt out and also sew over there. And again multiple times to make sure that it is secured. And now cut the seam allowance and then give the loop a good press, and do the same also with the other loop. And now you can put your belt through the loops. And for the next step, take your bias binding tape and your sleeve. Fold in the starting end by about 8 mm so the raw edge is enclosed and will not fray. And then open one folded edge of the bias tape. Place the bias tape right sides together with the sleeve edge, aligning the raw edge of the tape with the raw edge of the sleeve hem. And now pin in place all around. Make sure the tape is laid on smoothly. Do not stretch it and do not let it too loose. And when you reach the end point, cut the tape 1 centimeter longer and then fold the ending edge of the bias tape in by about 8 millimeters as well, so this raw edge is enclosed and cannot fray, and overlap it a little bit neatly. And now you can sew the bias tape to the sleeve, stitching close to the fold line of the open tape. This is usually about 1 to 2 millimeters from the crease line. And then fold the bias tape away from the sleeve, and from the right side top stitch on the bias tape very close to the seam you just sewed. This keeps the seam allowance flat and gives a crisp edge. And then press the seam flat. The next step is to fold the bias tape fully to the inside, wrapping it over the raw edge so the tape is no longer visible from the outside. And the folded edge should cover the stitch line to the inside and secure it all around with some pins. And now sew the binding from the inside by top stitching close to the folded edge, all around. And this is how your sleeve hem should look like now from the inside and from the outside. And repeat the step also for your other sleeve and give the seam after a good press. And now we do these steps also for the raw edges of the jacket in the same way as the sleeve hems. It's the best way to start at the center back seam where the join will be least visible. So take your bias binding tape and fold in the starting end by about 8 millimeters so the raw edge is enclosed and won't fray. Open one folded side of the tape and place it right sides together with the jacket edge, aligning the raw edges. And now pin all around the jacket. Make sure the tape lies smooth along curves and corners, not stretched and not too loose. And now sew the bias tape to the jacket by stitching next to the fold line of the open tape, about 1 to 2 millimeters from the crease. And after, at the curves, make a few small clips into the seam allowance, cutting close to but not through the stitching line. This reduces bulk and allows the fabric to turn smoothly when the bias tape is folded to the inside. And now fold the bias tape away from the jacket. From the right side, top stitch on the bias tape very close to the seam you just sewed. This keeps the seam allowance flat and gives a crisp edge. And now press the seam flat. And then wrap the bias tape fully to the inside of the jacket so it covers the raw edges and is no longer visible from the outside. Ensure the folded edge covers the stitch line on the inside. And then top stitch close to the folded edge to secure it. And the last step is to sew all around the edges of the jacket, including the hem, front edges and neckline to secure the bias tape on the inside. Stitch evenly at about 8 mm from the edge or consistent with your binding width, making sure you catch the folded bias tape on the inside. And sew very slowly to make a really beautiful outcome. And now give it a good press. And your Kylie jacket is finished. I hope you love wearing it as much as I love showing you how to make it. Happy sewing and see you in the next tutorial.